Judge Michael Patterson's weathered hands gripped the mahogany gavel with more force than necessary as he brought it down against the sound block for the third time in 5 minutes. The sharp crack echoed through the packed courtroom like a gunshot, but it barely managed to quiet the rising tide of voices that threatened to overwhelm the sacred halls of justice. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the courthouse's aggressive air conditioning, and his black robes felt heavier than usual. As he shifted in his high-backed leather chair, the case before him had been brewing for months. A controversial police brutality incident that had divided the community along razor-sharp lines. On one side sat the family of Marcus Thompson, a 23-year-old college student who claimed he'd been wrongfully arrested and beaten during a routine traffic stop. On the other side, the police department maintained their officers had acted within protocol when Thompson allegedly resisted arrest and reached for what appeared to be a weapon later discovered to be his cell phone. Attorney Rebecca Walsh, representing the Thompson family, stood at the plaintiff's table with fire in her eyes. Her usually pristine blonde hair showed signs of stress, with several strands escaping her normally perfect bun. She'd been pacing for the better part of an hour, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor like a metronome, counting down to an explosion. "Your Honor," she declared, her voice cutting through the murmurs, "the evidence clearly shows excessive force was used against my client. The body cam footage speaks for itself." Across the aisle, District Attorney James Morrison adjusted his burgundy tie for the dozenth time, his face flushed red with frustration. Morrison had built his career on defending law enforcement, and this case felt personal. His own brother had been killed in the line of duty 15 years ago, making every attack on police officers feel like an attack on his family's memory. "Objection, Your Honor," he bellowed, rising from his chair so quickly it scraped against the floor. "Counsel is mischaracterizing the evidence and inflaming the jury with emotional manipulation rather than facts." The gallery behind both legal teams buzzed with barely contained energy. Supporters of the Thompson family filled the left side of the courtroom, many wearing black t-shirts emblazoned with "Justice for Marcus" in bold white letters. Some clutched tissues, others held hands in silent prayer, while a few younger activists whispered among themselves, their eyes burning with the intensity of those who'd seen too much injustice in their short lives. The right side told a different story. Police officers in uniform and civilian clothes sat shoulder to shoulder with their families, their faces stoic, but their eyes revealing the strain of months of public scrutiny. Wives squeezed their husbands' hands, children sat quietly beside. Parents they'd learned to fear might not come home from work, and retired officers who'd served the community for decades wondered if their years of service meant nothing anymore. Outside the courthouse, the situation was even more volatile. News vans from every major network lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the gray October sky like mechanical flowers seeking sunlight. Reporters with perfectly styled hair and serious expressions spoke into cameras while protesters chanted behind them, "No justice, no peace," echoed from one group, while "Back the Blue" rang out from another. Police barriers separated the two factions, but tension crackled in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Judge Patterson rubbed his temples, feeling every one of his 58 years weighing on his shoulders. He'd presided over hundreds of cases during his 15-year tenure on the bench gang trials, domestic violence cases, drug trafficking rings, and even a few death penalty cases that still haunted his dreams. But nothing had prepared him for the media circus surrounding this case. His phone had been ringing off the hook for weeks with interview requests. His wife had received threatening letters at their home, and his teenage daughter had been harassed at school by classmates on both sides of the issue. The morning had started with his usual routine: a cup of black coffee, a quick scan of the newspaper headlines that made his stomach churn, and a silent prayer in his chambers, that somehow justice would prevail over politics. But as soon as court had convened, chaos had erupted. The prosecution's key witness had failed to show up. The defense had filed a last-minute motion to suppress evidence, and tempers in the gallery had flared when someone shouted an obscenity during opening arguments. His bailiff, Tony Rodriguez, a former Marine who'd seen combat in Afghanistan, stood at attention near the side door, his hand resting casually but meaningfully on his service weapon. Tony had served in this courtroom for 8 years and had never seen tensions run this high. Even during the high-profile gang trials, there had been an underlying respect for the legal process. Today felt different. Today felt dangerous. The court reporter, Mrs. Henderson, sat hunched over her stenotype machine, her fingers flying across the keys as she captured every heated word. At 62, she'd been recording courtroom proceedings longer than Judge Patterson had been practicing law. She'd seen lawyers throw chairs, defendants attempt to escape through windows, and even a few judges lose their temper and storm off the bench. But the raw emotion filling the room today reminded her uncomfortably of the civil rights trials from her early career, the same sense that the outcome would ripple far beyond these four walls. As the arguments continued to escalate, Judge Patterson felt his patience wearing thin. Both attorneys were grandstanding for the cameras rather than focusing on the law. The jury looked overwhelmed by the intensity of the proceedings, and he could sense that his control over the courtroom was slipping like sand through his fingers. Just as he raised his gavel again, preparing to call for order or perhaps even a recess, something caught his eye. A flash of yellow near the back of the courtroom, something that didn't belong in this temple of adult conflict and legal complexity. His judicial instincts, honed by years of reading people and situations, told him that whatever he was seeing was about to change everything. He paused mid-motion, the gavel suspended in air as his eyes focused on what would soon become the most important moment of his career. 3-year-old Emma Rodriguez stood frozen in the doorway of the imposing courtroom, her tiny fingers wrapped around the worn fabric ear of her stuffed elephant. Mr. Peanuts. The elephant had been her constant companion since her 2nd birthday, and today its gray fur was damp from her nervous grip. Her wide brown eyes, framed by impossibly long lashes that made strangers stop and smile, took in the overwhelming grandeur before her with a mixture of wonder and uncertainty. The courtroom stretched out like a cathedral of justice, its vaulted ceilings seeming to reach toward heaven itself. Massive wooden beams crossed overhead, their dark surfaces polished to a mirror-like shine that reflected the soft glow of ornate brass chandeliers. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced judges from decades past, their painted eyes seeming to watch over the proceedings with silent authority. To little Emma, they looked like the serious grown-ups in her grandmother's old photo albums, important people who never smiled. Her bright yellow sundress, adorned with tiny white daisies that her grandmother had carefully pressed that morning, stood out like a ray of sunshine against the somber browns and blacks that dominated the room. Emma had insisted on wearing her princess dress for what Abula had called a very important day, though the 3-year-old didn't fully understand why today was different from any other Tuesday. The dress rustled softly as she took tentative steps forward, her small white sandals making barely a whisper against the cold marble floor. Maria Rodriguez, Emma's 64-year-old grandmother, had stepped outside the courtroom for what she'd promised would be just 1 minute, Mia. The phone call from the immigration office was crucial. They needed to confirm some final paperwork details before her citizenship ceremony scheduled for later that afternoon. Maria had been waiting for this day for 23 years ever, since she'd arrived in the United States with nothing but hope and determination. She'd left Emma sitting quietly in the back row with strict instructions to stay put and be good, never imagining that her granddaughter's natural curiosity would lead her on an adventure that would change multiple lives. Emma's attention was immediately captured by the elaborate setup at the front of the room. The judge's bench rose like a fortress, its dark wood carved with intricate designs that reminded her of the fairy tale books Abuela read to her before bedtime. Behind the bench hung the largest American flag she'd ever seen, its red, white, and blue colors bright and proud against the neutral walls. She'd seen similar flags at the grocery store and her preschool, but this one seemed more important somehow, more real. The golden scales of justice, positioned prominently on the judge's desk, caught the light from the chandeliers and sent tiny rainbows dancing across the ceiling. To Emma, they looked like a magical toy, something that might grant wishes if you asked very nicely. She wondered if the serious man in the black robe was some kind of king or wizard, sitting so high above everyone else, like he could see the whole world from up there. But it wasn't the impressive architecture or formal trappings that truly captured Emma's attention. It was something far more subtle, yet infinitely more powerful. A scent lingered in the air that made her heart race with recognition, a mixture of leather, aftershave, and something uniquely masculine that she couldn't name but knew deep in her bones. It was a smell that haunted her dreams and filled her with both comfort and crushing sadness. The aroma triggered a flood of fragmented memories that her young mind couldn't fully process, but her heart remembered perfectly. Strong arms lifting her high into the air while she giggled with delight. A deep voice singing silly songs in Spanish while warm hands braided her hair. The sound of heavy boots on the kitchen floor and the jingle of keys and badges that meant safety and love and home. And always, always the presence of something else, something loyal and protective and furry that had been part of those precious moments. Emma took another step forward, her stuffed elephant dragging slightly behind her. The heated arguments and raised voices that had dominated the courtroom seemed to fade into background noise as her senses focused on that achingly familiar scent. Her free hand reached up to touch the small silver locket around her neck. Gift from Abuela that contained the only photo she had of her father in his police uniform, standing proudly next to his canine partner. The courtroom's occupants were so absorbed in their legal battle that none noticed the small figure making her way slowly down the center aisle. Emma's sandals made soft pattering sounds against the marble, like raindrops on a window pane, but the noise was swallowed by the passionate arguments echoing from the front of the room. She moved with the careful deliberation of a child navigating an adult world, her instincts telling her this was a place where she needed to be very, very good. As she walked, Emma's eyes searched the room for the source of that familiar smell. Her heart pounded with an excitement she couldn't understand or explain. Somewhere in this grand room filled with serious grown-ups and important business, there was something that reminded her of home of the time before the men in uniforms came to tell Abuela why Daddy wouldn't be coming home anymore. The little girl paused halfway down the aisle, her head tilting slightly as her senses continued to process the complex mixture of sounds, smells, and sights surrounding her. Mr. Peanuts was squeezed even tighter against her chest as she felt, both drawn forward by hope and held back by the overwhelming nature of her surroundings. Behind her, the heavy courtroom doors remained slightly ajar, waiting for Maria Rodriguez to return from her crucial phone call. Ahead of her, the heated legal proceedings continued unabated, none of the participants aware that their world was about to be turned upside down by the innocent observations of a 3-year-old who saw the world through eyes unclouded by adult complications. Emma took another step forward, and then another, following her heart toward a reunion that would break and heal hearts in equal measure. Officer Sarah Martinez's polished black boots echoed with military precision against the marble floor as she approached the courthouse's side entrance, her hand resting gently on the leather leash that connected her to her 4-legged partner. Rex, a magnificent 4-year-old German shepherd, walked beside her with the confident stride of a seasoned professional. His coat was a striking combination of rich black and golden tan, meticulously groomed to perfection, and his intelligent, dark eyes surveyed their surroundings with the practiced awareness of a dog trained to protect and serve. Sarah had been partnered with Rex for 2 years, ever since graduating from the intensive K-9 training program at the State Police Academy. The bond between them had formed quickly and deeply. Rex wasn't just her work partner, he was her best friend, confidant, and the reason she looked forward to coming to work each day. At 28 years old, Sarah had already earned a reputation as one of the department's most dedicated officers, but it was her work with Rex that truly made her shine. Today's courthouse visit wasn't part of their regular patrol duties. The Community Relations Department had organized a special demonstration designed to bridge the growing gap between law enforcement and the citizens they served. In light of recent tensions surrounding police conduct, the department had decided to showcase the gentler side of law enforcement through their K-9 program. Rex had been specifically chosen for these community events because of his exceptional temperament around children and his ability to remain calm in chaotic environments. The demonstration wasn't scheduled to begin for another hour, but Sarah believed in thorough preparation. She wanted Rex to acclimate to the courtroom's unique atmosphere, the formal setting, the elevated stress levels, and the mixture of unfamiliar scents and sounds that could potentially distract even the most well-trained police dog. Rex had performed flawlessly in schools, community centers, and public parks, but a courthouse presented different challenges entirely. As they entered through the side door, Sarah immediately noticed the tension crackling through the air, like electricity. The heated arguments from the ongoing trial created an undercurrent of anxiety that even she could feel, and she knew Rex's heightened senses would pick up on the emotional turmoil even more acutely. She watched his ears swivel forward, his nostrils flaring slightly as he processed the complex mixture of human emotions, legal documents, and cleaning supplies that created the courthouse's distinctive atmosphere. Rex's training had taught him to distinguish between normal stress and genuine threats, but the intensity of emotions in this particular courtroom was unlike anything in his experience. His keen senses detected anger, fear, frustration, and sadness all woven together in a tapestry of human conflict that made his protective instincts heighten. Yet his discipline remained perfect. He stayed in the precise heel position Sarah had taught him, his powerful body coiled with controlled energy. The German shepherd's reputation in the department was legendary. Rex had successfully located over 50 pounds of narcotics in his 2-year career, helped apprehend 12 fleeing suspects, and participated in countless community events where his gentle nature had won over even the most skeptical citizens. Children especially seemed drawn to his calm demeanor and expressive eyes, and Sarah had watched him patiently endure countless tiny hands pulling at his ears and fur during school visits. But today felt different. As they positioned themselves near the side wall of the courtroom, Rex's usual professional composure seemed slightly off balance. His ears kept twitching toward the back of the room, and Sarah noticed his tail wasn't held in its typical confident position. Instead, it swayed slightly, almost tentatively, as if he was trying to process something that didn't quite fit his training protocols. Sarah followed Rex's gaze toward the rear of the courtroom, scanning for whatever had captured his attention. The heated arguments between the attorneys continued to dominate the room's atmosphere, and she could see Judge Patterson's growing frustration written clearly across his weathered features. The gallery was packed with supporters from both sides of the controversial case, their opposing energies creating palpable waves of tension. At first, Sarah couldn't identify what had triggered Rex's unusual behavior. Her trained eye swept across the familiar scene of legal proceedings, the formal arrangement of tables and chairs, the court reporter's steady rhythm, the bailiff's watchful stance. Everything appeared normal for a high-profile trial, albeit more emotionally charged than most. Then Rex did something completely unexpected. The disciplined police dog, who never broke formation without a direct command, took half a step forward, his powerful haunches tensing as if he was preparing to move. His intelligent eyes had locked onto something specific, and a soft whine escaped his throat, not the alert sound he made when detecting drugs or danger, but something else entirely. Something that sounded almost mournful. Sarah's hand instinctively tightened on his leash, but she trusted Rex's instincts implicitly. In their 2 years together, his unusual behaviors had always led to important discoveries. Whether it was detecting hidden narcotics that human officers had missed, or sensing the emotional state of a domestic violence victim, Rex's intuition had proven invaluable time and again. His nose lifted slightly, sampling the air with the scientific precision of a trained detection dog. But this wasn't the focused, methodical sniffing he employed when searching for contraband. This was something more personal, more emotional. His entire body language shifted from professional alertness to something Sarah had never seen before, a mixture of excitement, confusion, and what could only be described as hope. The magnificent German shepherd's tail began to wag, just barely, in a controlled rhythm that seemed to match his accelerated heartbeat. His dark eyes remained fixed on whatever had captured his attention in the back of the courtroom, and Sarah could feel the tension building in his powerful frame, like a coiled spring ready to release. Rex had detected something that transcended his police training, something that spoke to a deeper part of his canine soul. As Sarah watched her partner's unusual behavior with growing curiosity and concern, she had no idea that they were about to become part of a moment that would change not only their lives, but the lives of everyone in that courtroom. The air itself seemed to hold its breath as Rex's professional composure continued to crack, revealing something raw and emotional beneath his perfectly trained exterior. Time seemed to crystallize into a single, breathless moment as Emma Rodriguez's eyes locked onto Rex across the length of the courtroom. The heated arguments between attorneys, the shuffling of papers, the whispered conversations in the gallery, all of it faded into a muted backdrop as something far more profound took center stage. Emma's small world, already turned upside down by months of confusion and loss, tilted completely off its axis as recognition sparked in her young mind like lightning, illuminating a dark sky. Her tiny fingers, still clutched around Mr. Peanut's worn ear, began to tremble uncontrollably. The stuffed elephant that had been her anchor through countless sleepless nights suddenly felt inadequate against the overwhelming surge of emotions coursing through her 3-year-old heart. Her brown eyes, wide with wonder moments before, now filled with a complex mixture of joy, confusion, and desperate hope that no child should ever have to experience. The German shepherd's distinctive silhouette, the proud carriage of his head, the alert positioning of his ears, the confident stance that spoke of both strength and gentleness, triggered a cascade of memories that Emma's young mind had been struggling to process for 8 long months. Suddenly, she was transported back to Saturday mornings when a similar figure would bound through their small apartment, tail wagging with pure excitement at the prospect of spending the day with his favorite little girl. Her memories were fragmented, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that she couldn't quite fit together, but the emotions attached to them were crystal clear. The feel of soft fur beneath her tiny palms, the warmth of a large body curled protectively beside her during afternoon naps, the sound of playful barking mixing with her own delighted giggles as they chased each other around the backyard. And always, the presence of the man who made everything safe and right in her world, the man who would come home each evening with stories of his day and his faithful 4-legged partner. Emma's breathing became shallow and rapid as her heart pounded against her small rib cage. The rational part of her mind, limited though it was by her age, tried to make sense of what she was seeing. But the emotional part, the part that had been crying herself to sleep every night, asking Abuela when Daddy was coming home, overruled all logic and whispered the impossible hope that maybe, somehow, her prayers had been answered. Judge Patterson, his attention momentarily diverted from the legal circus playing out before him, found his gaze drawn to the small commotion developing in the back of his courtroom. His judicial instincts, honed by years of reading people and situations, immediately recognized that something significant was happening. The little girl in the yellow dress who had wandered into his courtroom was no longer just an innocent bystander. She had become the focal point of an emotional drama that he couldn't yet understand but could feel reverberating through the very air around them. The seasoned judge watched as Emma took one hesitant step forward, then stopped, her entire body rigid with tension. He could see her internal struggle playing out across her expressive features, the war between hope and fear, between the desperate desire to believe and the learned caution of a child who had already experienced more loss than most adults. Her small chest rose and fell rapidly, and even from his elevated position, Patterson could see the tears beginning to gather in her eyes like storm clouds on the horizon. Officer Martinez, still puzzled by Rex's unusual behavior, followed her partner's unwavering gaze toward the back of the courtroom. Her trained eye immediately picked out the small figure that had captured Rex's complete attention, and she felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the same protective instinct that had drawn her to law enforcement in the first place. Something about the child's posture, the way she held herself with barely contained emotion, spoke to Sarah's maternal instincts, even though she had never had children of her own. Rex's professional composure continued to crack like ice under pressure. His tail, which had been swaying with controlled uncertainty, began to wag more definitively. His intelligent eyes never left the small girl, and a soft whine escaped his throat, not the alert sound he made when detecting contraband or danger, but something infinitely more personal. It was the sound of recognition, of connection, of a bond that transcended training and protocol. The courtroom's atmosphere began to shift as more people became aware of the silent drama unfolding. The court reporter's fingers slowed on her stenotype machine as she glanced up from her work. The bailiff's hand moved away from his weapon as he recognized that whatever was happening posed no physical threat, though the emotional intensity was palpable. Even some of the spectators in the gallery began to turn in their seats, following the collective gaze toward the small girl who seemed to be gathering courage for something momentous. Emma took another shaky step forward, and then another. Her movement was magnetic, drawing the attention of everyone who noticed her like iron filings to a magnet. The yellow dress that had seemed so bright and cheerful earlier now appeared almost ethereal in the formal courtroom setting, as if she were a small angel who had wandered into a place of human conflict and complexity. Her small voice, when it finally emerged, started as barely more than a whisper. But in the relative quiet that had begun to settle over the courtroom, as people sensed something important was happening, even the softest sound carried weight. Emma's lips moved silently at first, as if she were practicing words that were too important, too dangerous, too hopeful to say aloud. The stuffed elephant in her arms seemed to give her strength, and slowly, trembling with the weight of 8 months of grief and confusion and desperate longing, Emma raised her tiny finger and pointed directly at the magnificent German shepherd, who had unknowingly become the key to unlocking her broken heart. The courtroom held its collective breath, sensing that whatever came next would change everything for everyone present. Even the arguing attorneys began to quiet, drawn by the magnetic pull of a moment that transcended legal proceedings and touched something far more fundamental about human connection, loss, and the innocent hope that refuses to die even in the darkest circumstances. The words erupted from Emma Rodriguez's small chest with the force of 8 months of suppressed grief, confusion, and desperate longing. Her voice, clear and piercing as a church bell, cut through the courtroom's tension like a blade through. Silk. The two simple words hung in the air with such raw emotion that every person present felt them resonate in their bones, their hearts, their very souls. Emma's tiny arm stretched forward with unwavering certainty, her finger pointing directly at Rex with the absolute conviction that only a 3-year-old could possess. Her brown eyes, now streaming with tears that caught the light from the ornate chandeliers above, blazed with a mixture of joy, relief, and heartbreaking hope. The stuffed elephant tumbled from her other arm, forgotten in the overwhelming moment of what she believed was a miraculous reunion. My daddy, she repeated, her voice growing stronger and more insistent with each repetition. The words seemed to gather power as they left her lips, transforming from a whisper of hope into a declaration of absolute faith. To Emma's 3-year-old mind, the logic was simple and unshakable. If the doggy was here, then Daddy must be here too. They had never been apart in her memories, and her innocent heart couldn't conceive of a world where one could exist without the other. Judge Patterson's fountain pen slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering onto his leather-bound legal pad with a sound that seemed amplified in the stunned silence. The seasoned jurist, who had presided over cases involving the most hardened criminals and the most tragic circumstances, felt his professional composure crumble like ancient parchment. His hand moved instinctively to his chest, where his heart hammered against his ribs with an intensity that reminded him of his long-ago combat service in Vietnam. The transformation in the courtroom was immediate and absolute. The heated arguments that had been raging moments before died as if someone had thrown a switch, leaving behind an eerie quiet broken only by Emma's continued declarations and the soft sound of her sandaled feet taking another step forward. Attorney Rebecca Walsh, mid-sentence in what had been a passionate objection, found her words dying in her throat as she turned to see the source of the interruption. District Attorney Morrison, his face still flushed with the heat of legal battle, felt his anger evaporate like morning mist as his eyes fell upon the small figure in yellow. Officer Sarah Martinez stood frozen, her training completely inadequate to prepare her for this moment. Rex's leash felt suddenly heavy in her hand as she watched her professionally disciplined partner respond to something that transcended all their careful preparation and conditioning. The German shepherd's entire body language had shifted from professional alertness to something she had never witnessed before, a mixture of recognition, confusion, and what could only be described as profound sadness. Rex's intelligent dark eyes moved between the crying child and the shocked adults surrounding them, his canine instincts picking up on emotional currents that the humans were only beginning to process. His powerful frame trembled slightly, as if he too was struggling with recognition that he couldn't fully understand. The dog's training told him to remain at heel, to maintain his professional composure, but something deeper, something primal and emotional, urged him toward the small girl whose voice carried notes of such pure need and desperate hope. Gallery erupted into a mixture of whispered conversations and stunned silence. The supporters of both sides in the police brutality case found their passionate positions temporarily forgotten as they witnessed something that transcended legal arguments and political divisions. Parents in the crowd instinctively reached for their own children, recognizing in Emma's cry the universal sound of a child calling for the person who represented safety, love, and home. Mrs. Henderson, the court reporter, found her fingers frozen above the stenotype keys for the first time in 40 years of service. The words she was supposed to be capturing seemed too sacred, too raw, too heartbreakingly personal to reduce to official transcript. Her own eyes filled with tears as she watched the small drama unfold, knowing that she was witnessing something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Emma took another step forward, her movement causing Rex to strain slightly against his leash. The connection between child and dog was magnetic, electric, impossible to ignore or explain through rational thought. Her tears fell freely now, creating tiny dark spots on the marble floor as she moved with the determination of someone who had been lost and finally, miraculously, found their way home. "Daddy's doggy," she called out, her voice cracking with emotion. "Where's Daddy? Where is he?" The questions tumbled from her lips with increasing urgency. Her 3-year-old mind unable to understand why the familiar presence of the dog wasn't accompanied by the warm, strong arms that should be lifting her up and spinning her around in the joyful reunion she had dreamed of every night for 8 months. The bailiff, Tony Rodriguez, felt his own eyes burning with unshed tears as he recognized something achingly familiar in the child's desperate hope. His mind immediately went to his own young daughter at home, and he found himself silently praying that she would never have to experience whatever loss had driven this little girl to such desperate recognition. Judge Patterson slowly rose from his chair, his black robes rustling in the profound silence. The movement drew every eye in the courtroom, but his gaze remained fixed on the small girl, whose 2 simple words had managed to accomplish what ours of legal arguments could not. They had united every person present in a moment of shared, human emotion that transcended all boundaries of politics, profession, and personal agenda. The weight of those 2 words, "my daddy," continued to reverberate through the courtroom like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. In that moment, everyone present understood that they were no longer simply witnesses to a legal proceeding, but participants in something far more profound, a child's innocent faith, colliding with the harsh realities of a world that had already taken too much from her young life. The silence stretched, pregnant with emotion and anticipation, as every person in the room held their breath and waited for anyone, to explain how 2 simple words from a 3-year-old could carry such devastating power. The heavy courtroom doors burst open with a sharp bang that echoed like a gunshot through the stunned silence. Maria Rodriguez rushed inside, her weathered face pale with panic, and her chest heaving from running down the courthouse's long marble corridors. Her gray hair, usually meticulously styled for this most important day of her American dream, had come loose from its careful bun and framed her worried features in silver wisps that caught the light. "Emma! Mia, no!" Maria called out in a mixture of Spanish and English, her voice thick with embarrassment and fear. At 64 years old, she had survived poverty, immigration, and the death of her son, but nothing had prepared her for the sight of her granddaughter standing in the middle of a formal courtroom, pointing at a police dog while tears streamed down her small face. The immigration papers still clutched in Maria's trembling hand crinkled as she hurried toward Emma, her sensible black shoes clicking rapidly against the marble floor. But as Maria's eyes fell upon the German shepherd that had captured Emma's complete attention, her forward momentum faltered. Her own breath caught in her throat as recognition hit her like a physical blow. The dog's coloring, his proud stance, the intelligent way he held his head, everything about Rex was so heartbreakingly similar to Bruno that for a moment, Maria herself wondered if she was seeing a ghost from her family's shattered past. "I'm so sorry," Maria said to the courtroom at large, her accented English heavy with mortification. "She doesn't understand. She's just a baby. Please forgive us." Her hands shook as she reached for Emma, but her granddaughter stepped away, her small body rigid with determination, and her finger still pointing unwaveringly at Rex. Judge Patterson, his judicial composure hanging by a thread, descended from his bench with slow, measured steps. His movement commanded the attention of the entire courtroom, and the silence deepened as everyone waited for his response. But instead of the stern rebuke that many expected, His weathered face showed only compassion as he approached the distraught grandmother and her inconsolable granddaughter. "Ma'am," Judge Patterson said gently, his voice carrying the authority of his position, but tempered with kindness. "There's no need to apologize. But perhaps you could help us understand what's happening here. Why does your granddaughter think this police dog is connected to her father?" Maria's composure, carefully maintained through months of grief counseling and well-meaning advice from social workers, finally cracked. The tears she had been holding back since Emma's first heartbroken cry of "my daddy" began to flow freely down her lined cheeks. Her shoulders shook as the weight of 8 months of trying to be strong for a 3-year-old who couldn't understand why her world had been torn apart finally became too much to bear alone. Her father, Maria began, her voice breaking like fragile glass, was Police Officer David Rodriguez, badge number 2847. He worked for the Metro K-9 unit for 6 years. She paused, struggling to find the English words that could possibly convey the magnitude of their loss. He was killed 8 months ago, shot during a traffic stop that went wrong. He died trying to protect a family with children in their car. The courtroom collectively inhaled, the sound like wind through autumn leaves. Officer Martinez felt her knees weaken as the pieces of the tragic puzzle began to fall into place. Her hand instinctively tightened on Rex's leash as she remembered the memorial service she had attended last spring, the sea of blue uniforms, the flag-draped coffin, the heartbreaking sight of a police dog sitting vigil beside his fallen handler's casket. David's partner, Maria continued, her voice barely above a whisper, was a German shepherd named Bruno. They looked exactly alike. She gestured toward Rex, unable to finish the sentence. Emma was Daddy's little shadow. Every day when David came home, Bruno would run to her first, before anyone else. They were inseparable, David, Bruno, and Minita. Emma, still pointing at Rex with unwavering determination, began to speak in the mixture of Spanish and English that she used when her emotions overwhelmed her limited vocabulary. "Donde está? Mi papa? Where is Daddy? Bruno, where's Daddy?" Her voice rose with increasing desperation as the adult conversation continued around her without providing the answers her heart needed. Maria knelt beside her granddaughter, her own tears making her voice thick and difficult to understand. "She doesn't comprehend, Beth," she explained to the silent courtroom. "How do you explain to a 3-year-old that her hero, her whole world, is never coming home? Every night she sits by the window, waiting. Every morning she asks when Daddy and Bruno are coming back from work." The revelation hit the courtroom like a physical force. Attorney Walsh pressed her hand to her mouth, her earlier legal passion completely forgotten in the face of such raw human tragedy. District Attorney Morrison, who had spent the morning arguing passionately about police procedures and protocol, found himself thinking about his own children waiting for him at home, and the officers who would never make it back to theirs. Rex, as if sensing the emotional weight of the revelation, began to whine softly. His canine instincts picked up on the grief that permeated the air, and his training to comfort victims of trauma seemed to override his professional discipline. He strained gently against his leash, not with the urgency of a dog detecting drugs or danger, but with the gentle insistence of an animal recognizing someone in desperate need. "Bruno was retired after David's death," Maria continued, her voice growing stronger as she shared her family's story. "The department said it was protocol when a handler dies. The dog can't work anymore. He lives now with David's partner, Officer Kelly, but Emma." She looked down at her granddaughter, whose small body was trembling with the effort of containing emotions too big for her tiny frame to hold. "Emma keeps asking why Bruno doesn't come visit anymore. Why Daddy doesn't come home. She's been seeing a child psychologist, but every time she sees a German shepherd, every time she smells that particular mixture of leather and aftershave that police officers carry, she thinks Maria's voice broke completely. The truth hung in the air like incense, sacred and heartbreaking. In that moment, every person in the courtroom understood that they had witnessed something far more profound than a case of mistaken identity. They had seen a child's pure love colliding with the harsh reality of loss, a 3-year-old's faith that love could somehow bring back everything that mattered most in her small world. Judge Patterson felt tears he hadn't shed since his own father's funeral threatening to fall as he looked down at Emma, still pointing at Rex with a desperate hope that somehow, someway, her daddy would appear if she just believed hard enough. Judge Michael Patterson stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, his black robes suddenly feeling like ceremonial vestments in a cathedral of human suffering, rather than the professional uniform of legal authority. The weight of his position, which had always provided him strength and purpose, now seemed insignificant in the face of a 3-year-old's profound loss. His weathered hands, which had signed countless sentences and legal documents over 15 years, trembled slightly as he processed the magnitude of what he had just witnessed. The transformation within Judge Patterson was seismic. 23 years of legal practice had built walls around his heart necessary, barriers that allowed him to make difficult decisions without being paralyzed by emotion. He had presided over death penalty cases, child custody battles that tore families apart, and domestic violence trials that revealed humanity's darkest impulses. But nothing in his extensive career had prepared him for the pure, innocent heartbreak of a child who couldn't understand why her hero would never come home. As he looked down at Emma, still pointing at Rex with unwavering determination despite her grandmother's gentle attempts to pull her away, Patterson saw something that shattered every professional defense he had carefully constructed. In Emma's tear-stained face, he saw his own daughter Sarah at that age, full of absolute faith that her daddy could fix anything, solve any problem, chase away any monster. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Sarah, at 3 years old, running to the true door every evening at exactly 6:47 p.m., the time his car typically pulled into their driveway, calling Daddy's home. Daddy's home. With the same pure joy he heard in Emma's voice when she cried, "My daddy." The judge's knees felt weak as another memory surfaced. His son Michael Jr., now a sophomore at Georgetown Law School, but once a small boy who wore his father's oversized tie to career day at school and proudly announced his classmates that his daddy was the most important person in the whole world. The unconditional love and trust that children placed in their parents was a sacred responsibility, one that Officer David Rodriguez had carried faithfully until a single moment of violence had stolen him away from the little girl who needed him most. Slowly, deliberately, Judge Patterson began to descend from his elevated bench. Each step down felt symbolic, as if he were shedding layers of judicial formality and returning to something more fundamental, his basic humanity. The courtroom watched in respectful silence as their commanding authority figure transformed before their eyes into something more vulnerable, more real. His black robes rustled softly as he approached the small family, and Patterson could feel the weight of every eye in the courtroom following his movement. This was unprecedented. In 15 years on the bench, he had never left his position during proceedings, never broken the formal barrier between judicial authority and the people who appeared before him. But Emma's story had shattered all protocols, all professional boundaries. When Judge Patterson reached Emma's level, he did something that would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. This distinguished jurist, this pillar of legal authority, slowly lowered himself to one knee, bringing his face level with the 3-year-old who had unknowingly become the most important person in his courtroom. "Hola, Pequega," he said gently, his voice carrying traces of the Spanish he had learned during his years serving the diverse community of Riverside County. The words came naturally, drawn from countless interactions with families like Emma's, who had come before his court-seeking. Justice, citizenship, or simply a fair hearing in their adopted homeland. Emma's tear-filled eyes widened as she realized this important man, the one who sat so high above everyone else like a king in her storybooks, was speaking directly to her in words she understood. Her pointing finger slowly lowered, though. Her gaze never left Rex, who remained perfectly still under Officer Martinez's gentle but firm control. "I know you miss your papa," Judge Patterson continued, his own voice thick with emotion that he no longer tried to hide. "He was a very brave man, a hero who helped keep little girls like you safe. And his doggy, Bruno, was very special too." The judge's words carried the weight of absolute truth, spoken with the authority of someone who had seen enough of life to recognize genuine courage and sacrifice. Maria Rodriguez watched in amazement as this powerful figure, a man whose decisions affected the lives of thousands, knelt in his formal courtroom to comfort her grieving granddaughter. Her own tears flowed more freely as she realized that Emma was receiving something precious, acknowledgement of her loss from someone whose words carried the weight of official recognition. Officer Martinez, still maintaining her professional grip on Rex's leash, felt her own heart breaking as she watched the scene unfold. Her training had prepared her for many difficult situations, but not for this moment when the formal boundaries between law enforcement, the justice system, and the families they served dissolved completely. Rex seemed to sense the emotional significance of the moment, his intelligent eyes moving between the kneeling judge and the small girl, who had recognized something in him that transcended training and protocol. The courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath as Judge Patterson reached into his inner pocket and withdrew something unexpected, a small photograph, worn soft from years of being carried close to his heart. It showed his own children at Emma's age, laughing and playing in their backyard, their faces bright with the innocent joy that Emma had lost too early. "Your daddy loved you very, very much," Judge Patterson whispered, his voice barely audible, but carrying clearly in the profound silence. "And even though he can't come home, that love is still here." He touched his hand gently to Emma's chest, right over her heart, "and it will never, ever go away." Emma's small body began to shake, with sobs that seemed too large for her tiny frame to contain. But for the first time since the tragic events had begun, they weren't sobs of desperate hope or confusion. They were the beginning of something that might, someday, become healing. The most powerful person in that courtroom had knelt before her, had spoken her father's worth into the official record of law, and had promised her that love was stronger than loss. In that moment, justice took on a meaning that transcended legal precedent and courtroom procedure. It became about honoring sacrifice, acknowledging loss, and ensuring that a hero's daughter knew her father's life had mattered. What happened next would be recounted in news stories, shared in police departments across the nation, and remembered by everyone present as the day justice revealed its most beautiful face. Judge Michael Patterson, still kneeling before Emma Rodriguez, made a decision that would echo far beyond the walls of his courtroom. Rising slowly from his position, he turned to face the packed gallery and spoke words that would transform routine legal proceedings into something approaching the sacred. "This court declares an extended recess," he announced, his voice carrying new authority, not the power of judicial position, but the strength that comes from choosing compassion over protocol. "Today we have been reminded that justice isn't just about laws and verdicts. It's about honoring those who serve, protecting those who sacrifice, and ensuring that their children know their worth." The formal boundaries that typically governed courtroom behavior dissolved like morning mist. Officer Sarah Martinez, tears streaming freely down her cheeks, knelt beside Rex and gently removed his official working harness. "Would you like to meet my partner properly?" she asked Emma, her voice soft with understanding. "His name is Rex, and he's very gentle with little girls. Emma's grandmother Maria started to object, concerned about propriety and protocol, but Judge Patterson raised a gentle hand. "Today, Mrs. Rodriguez, this courtroom belongs to Emma," he said with quiet conviction. "Let her have whatever peace she can find here." Rex, freed from the constraints of his professional duties, approached Emma with the careful intelligence that marked all truly great police dogs. His dark eyes seemed to hold ancient wisdom as he lowered his powerful frame, allowing the small girl to touch his soft fur with trembling fingers. Emma's tears continued to fall, but they had transformed from desperate hope into something that might eventually become healing. "He feels like Bruno," Emma whispered, her small hands buried in Rex's thick coat. "But he's not Bruno, is he?" The question held the heartbreaking wisdom of a child, beginning to understand that some things, once lost, cannot be found again in the same form. "No, sweetheart," Officer Martinez replied gently. "He's not Bruno, but he's just as brave, and just as kind, and I think he understands about your daddy." As if responding to her words, Rex shifted closer to Emma, his warm presence offering the wordless comfort that only animals can provide. The courtroom doors opened again, and this time it was Bailiff Tony Rodriguez who entered, but he wasn't alone. Behind him came a small procession that would have been impossible to arrange under normal circumstances. But these were no longer normal circumstances. 3 more K-9 officers, having heard about the situation through the tight network of law enforcement communication, had arrived with their partners. Officer James Kelly entered first, his face drawn with emotion as he recognized the scene before him. Behind him walked Bruno, the real Bruno, Officer David Rodriguez's former partner. The 7-year-old German Shepherd had been retired since his handler's death, but he carried himself with the dignity of a veteran who had served with honor. His dark coat was now touched with silver around the muzzle, and his eyes held the weight of loss that only those who had loved deeply could understand. Emma's reaction was electric. Her entire body went rigid as she saw the familiar figure who had haunted her dreams and filled her waking hopes for 8 months. But this time, her recognition carried a different quality, not the desperate belief that her father would appear, but the profound comfort of being reunited with another piece of her lost world. "Bruno," she whispered, and the word carried 8 months of longing, confusion, and love. The retired police dog approached slowly, his tail wagging with the careful restraint of an animal who understood the gravity of the moment. When he reached Emma, he did something that brought tears to every eye in the courtroom. He gently placed his graying muzzle on her small shoulder and held it there, as if he too had been waiting for this reunion. Judge Patterson watched the scene with wonder as the courtroom filled with an energy that transcended legal proceedings. The other K-9 teams formed a loose circle around Emma, creating a protective barrier of service and dedication. Each dog seemed to understand that they were participating in something sacred, a moment when the thin line between duty and love, between service and family, completely disappeared. Officer Martinez spoke quietly to Emma about police dogs and their handlers, about the special bond between partners who trusted each other with their lives. She explained how Rex trained every day to keep people safe, just like Emma's daddy had done, just like Bruno had done. The other officers shared stories of courage and partnership, of dogs who had saved lives and handlers who had made the ultimate sacrifice. As the afternoon wore on, the formal courtroom transformed into something unprecedented. A carnal courtroom, place of healing where the machinery of justice paused to acknowledge what truly mattered. Other courthouse employees, drawn by the extraordinary nature of what was happening, quietly gathered to witness the scene. Lawyers forgot about their cases. Court reporters set aside their machines, and even the janitor stopped his work to watch a 3-year-old receive comfort from the very system that her father had died serving. When Maria Rodriguez's citizenship ceremony finally began hours later, it carried weight far beyond the legal transformation of her status. Judge Patterson spoke not just about the rights and responsibilities of citizenship, but about families who had paid the ultimate price for the freedoms that ceremony represented. Emma sat in the front row, a small American flag in one hand and a toy police badge in the other, gifts from the officers who had made this day possible. Today, Judge Patterson concluded, we have witnessed something that reminds us why we serve, why we sacrifice, and why justice must always be tempered with mercy. Officer David Rodriguez gave his life protecting others, and his daughter has reminded us all what true service means. As they prepared to leave the courthouse, Emma turned back toward Rex and the other K-9 teams. Her goodbye wasn't filled with the desperate clinging of someone afraid to let go, but with the gentle confidence of a child who had learned that love takes many forms and that heroes never truly leave us. They live on in the courage of those who continue their work. The little girl who had entered that courtroom, carrying the unbearable weight of loss, walked out carrying something infinitely more precious. The knowledge that her father's sacrifice was honored, his memory was treasured, and his love would live forever in the hearts of all who serve and protect.